In the quiet stillness of a small town, where everyone knows the familiar rhythm of the day and faces become as common as the streets they walk, moments pass unnoticed, slipping by in the mundane. A patrol car drives its usual route, an officer inside scanning his surroundings, eyes alert, but his mind on autopilot. It's just another day, another shift. The calls are routine. The roads are familiar. Nothing stands out. Until it does. Ahead, a car comes into view. A car the officer doesn't recognize, one that doesn't fit. His gaze sharpens. Maybe it's the driver, maybe the vehicle itself, but something tells him it's worth a closer look. Without hesitation, he reaches for the switch, and the red and blue lights flash across the empty stretch of road. A quick glance at his rearview mirror, then the familiar wail of the siren breaks the silence. He signals the driver to pull over. Another routine stop, another checkpoint on an otherwise uneventful day. As the car slows to the side of the road, the officer exits his vehicle. The weight of his duty hangs on his shoulders as he approaches, steps measured, hand resting on his belt. There's no tension here, no urgency, just the automatic response of someone used to being in control, someone who expects compliance, answers, and respect. The officer approaches the window, and what follows is a conversation that will test everything he thought he knew about power, authority, and the lines between them. But what the officer doesn't realize as he approaches is that the man behind the wheel is no ordinary driver. He doesn't know that the man sitting in that car holds a title he should respect, a position that demands recognition, a rank that supersedes his own. This driver, this man, is his superior, the police chief of the very department he serves. A man who has spent his career dedicated to upholding the law, ensuring justice, and commanding respect from all who wear the badge. And in that moment, the officer doesn't see him. He sees only what he wants to see, a man he assumes is out of place. The traffic stop that begins as a routine encounter is about to spiral into something far greater, something that will challenge the officer's sense of right and wrong, expose the hidden biases that influence his every decision, and leave an indelible mark on everyone involved. For in a matter of minutes, what should have been a simple request for identification will turn into a moment that changes everything for both men. A moment that will test the core of what it means to wear the badge and to serve with honor. And by the time this encounter ends, nothing in this small town or this police department will ever be the same. Today's story isn't just about a traffic stop. It's about two men standing on opposite sides of the same system, one enforcing the law, the other embodying it. On one side, we have a white police officer, a man used to asserting his authority on the streets, confident in his ability to judge the situation at a glance. He's done this 1,000 times before, pulling drivers over, running checks, and issuing tickets. His power is clear, reinforced by the uniform he wears and the authority he's been given. But today, his assumptions will be his undoing. On the other side, there's the black police chief, an accomplished, well-respected figure, known not just in his department, but throughout the community. A man who's climbed the ranks through hard work, integrity, and a deep commitment to justice. He knows the law inside and out, and he's dedicated his life to ensuring it's applied fairly to all. But today, he's not in uniform. Today, he's just a man behind the wheel of a car, quietly observing as the officer approaches, waiting to see how this routine stop will unfold. The officer doesn't recognize the chief. To him, the driver is just another face, another person who might be guilty of something. In this moment, his judgment is clouded not by facts, but by the invisible biases that guide his actions. The stop begins like any other, with the officer demanding license and registration, his tone firm, expecting obedience. But as the minutes pass, the situation begins to shift. The chief, calm and composed, hands over his identification, revealing his true position. And in that instant, everything changes. The officer realizes the grave mistake he's made, a mistake that can't be undone. What started as a routine traffic stop is now a confrontation with consequences far beyond the roadside. The officer's career, reputation, and future are all at risk. And the police chief? He now faces the difficult task of addressing the very issues he's worked so hard to prevent. Issues of racial bias, discrimination, and the abuse of power within his own department. This isn't just a story about a single incident. It's a story about the ways in which bias, both conscious and unconscious, can affect even the most routine of interactions. It's about how power can be misused and how those in authority must constantly be aware of the ways in. This story isn't just a reflection of one isolated moment. It's something many of us have witnessed. And for some, it's a reality they face far too often. The feeling of being judged, not for who you are, but for what others assume about you. The experience of being treated unfairly by someone in a position of power. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation? Have you ever been stopped, questioned, or judged simply because of who you are or how you look? Share your experiences in the comments below. We want to hear your stories, because only through sharing these moments can we start to see the bigger picture, the one that connects all of us in the fight for fairness and justice. And if you're passionate about real stories, about exploring the truth behind events like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Stay with us as we uncover the layers behind today's story, and many more just like it. Your voice matters, and we invite you to be a part of the conversation. In the days leading up to the stop, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The town was quiet, the kind of place where life moved at a slower pace, and people knew their neighbors. But beneath that calm exterior, tension simmered in places few were willing to acknowledge. Conversations about race, authority, and the role of law enforcement in the community were often avoided, spoken about in hushed tones. Yet these were not new issues. For years, the town's police department had been the subject of rumors, stories passed along at neighborhood gatherings, shared in whispered conversations. And at the center of many of those stories was one man, the officer who now approached the chief's car. He had been on the force for over a decade, a fixture on the streets, patrolling the same neighborhoods day after day. To some, he was a symbol of order, the kind of cop who never hesitated to enforce the rules. But for others, particularly in certain parts of town, his presence was less reassuring. His name had come up more than once in discussions about racial profiling. There had been complaints, small murmurs that grew louder over time, accusations of unnecessary stops, overly aggressive questioning, and an attitude that left many feeling less protected and more targeted. In the official records, these complaints seem minor, often dismissed as misunderstandings or brushed aside as part of the job. But for those who had been on the receiving end of his scrutiny, it was something far more personal. There was a pattern, they said, a tendency to see guilt before innocence, particularly when it came to people who didn't look like him. It wasn't every day, but it was often enough to be noticed, especially by those who couldn't escape his gaze. Yet the officer remained on the streets, confident in his role, his power unchecked. Then there was the police chief. His journey to the top had been anything but easy. Growing up in a neighboring town, he had seen the challenges faced by people of color in the justice system firsthand. Those experiences had shaped him, driven him to become a different kind of leader. He was a man of principle, someone who believed in fairness above all else. Throughout his career, he had earned a reputation for holding his officers to the highest standards, pushing for reforms that would ensure everyone in the community was treated with respect, regardless of their background. His leadership wasn't just about maintaining order, it was about building trust. Under his guidance, the department had seen changes, improvements that were slowly starting to make a difference. He had implemented new training programs, encouraged open dialogue about racial bias, and held officers accountable for their actions. He believed in the power of the badge, but he also believed it came with a responsibility that could not be taken lightly. And yet, even with all of the progress, he knew there were still cracks in the system, officers who hadn't fully embraced the change, officers like the one now standing outside his car. On that day, as the officer's patrol car came to a halt behind the chief's vehicle, the decision to pull him over was made in a split second. The car didn't belong. The driver didn't belong, at least not in the officer's mind. It was an instinctive reaction, one that didn't require much thought, just a simple assumption based on what he saw. He wasn't expecting much from this stop. Just another driver, another check. He would ask the questions, get the answers, and move on. But the officer's mind was already framing the situation before he even reached the window. He was preparing himself for resistance, for suspicion, for something that needed to be handled. As he approached, the officer's hand rested on his utility belt, ready for whatever might come next. He wasn't particularly concerned, but there was always that edge of caution, that sense of power he wielded in moments like these. He expected compliance. He expected control. What he didn't expect, what he couldn't foresee, was the man sitting inside the car, calmly watching him approach. The man whose very presence would turn the officer's assumptions on their head. In that moment, the officer didn't see the police chief. He didn't see the man who had spent years fighting to ensure that officers like him could serve their community with honor. What he saw was something entirely different. And in that fleeting moment of judgment, he set the stage for what would become the most consequential stop of his career. As the officer stood by the car window, he couldn't have known that this encounter was already being noticed by others. Onlookers from a nearby street corner watched with curiosity. Conversations began to stir. Social media posts would follow, and soon the incident would become more than just a routine stop. It would spark a wave of reactions from the community and beyond. Headlines about racial profiling, questions about authority, and debates about fairness were already familiar territory in this town. But this time, those headlines wouldn't be about someone else. They wouldn't be a distant story on the news. This time, it was happening right here. And in the hours to come, the full weight of this moment would be felt, not just by the officer and the chief, but by everyone who had a stake in what came next. As the tension mounted, there were already whispers spreading online. Stories of past incidents with the officer, comments about his reputation, shared on social media for the world to see. It wasn't long before the stop was being discussed in real time. People speculating on what was happening, some recognizing the chief's car, others wondering why a stop was being made at all. And with every passing moment, the stakes grew higher, the consequences more real. The officer, oblivious to the gathering storm, stood firm, convinced he was in control. But control is a fragile thing, especially when built on a foundation of assumptions. And in this moment, the ground beneath the officer's feet was about to shift in ways he could never have imagined. As the officer approached the car, there was no hesitation in his step. To him, this was just another stop, another driver who would comply, answer his questions, and be on their way. He leaned down to the window, his presence looming over the vehicle. The first words out of his mouth were sharp, cutting through the stillness of the afternoon. "License and registration," he demanded, his voice carrying the weight of authority. There was no greeting, no explanation, just a command. The officer had done this 100 times before, and it showed in his tone. He was in control. Or so he thought. Inside the car, the man behind the wheel moved calmly, without rush or alarm. He reached for his wallet, his movements deliberate, his face revealing none of the tension that was already building in the officer's demeanor. The chief handed over his license without a word, his eyes never leaving the officer's. But the silence between them only seemed to irritate the officer, who was expecting something else. Nervousness, perhaps, or excuses. What he got instead was quiet composure. "Where are you headed?" the officer asked, his tone still demanding, but now tinged with suspicion. He wasn't just gathering information, he was fishing for something more, something that would justify the stop in his mind. The response he received was as calm as the chief's demeanor. "Just passing through," the chief replied, his voice even, giving away nothing. The officer paused, his eyes narrowing. There was something about the man's calmness that bothered him, something that made him feel as though he wasn't in control of the situation like he normally would be. He glanced at the registration, his mind working to find something, anything, that would give him a reason to dig deeper. "You live around here?" the officer pressed, his voice growing tighter, more aggressive. The questions were routine, but the tone wasn't. He had already decided that this man didn't belong, and now he was searching for proof to confirm it. The chief met his gaze without flinching. "I'm familiar with the area," he said simply, his words carrying an air of quiet authority, though the officer didn't catch it yet. The chief wasn't offering explanations, wasn't trying to justify his presence. But the more the officer questioned, the more his own frustration started to show. The pause between them stretched uncomfortably. The officer shifted his weight, standing taller as if to reassert the power he felt slipping away. The chief's steady, measured responses were unsettling in a way the officer couldn't quite explain. He had expected compliance, maybe even a little fear, but what he got instead was calm and control. And that control wasn't his. "Step out of the car," the officer ordered, his tone harder now, more aggressive. He was no longer just performing his duty. He was asserting dominance, determined to remind the man in front of him who was in charge here. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that the balance of power had never been in his hands to begin with. The chief's expression didn't change. He reached for the door handle slowly, opening it with the same deliberate calmness he had shown throughout the encounter. As he stood, he towered over the officer, his presence commanding in a way that wasn't about physical size, but something deeper, something that the officer still hadn't realized. "Is there a problem, officer?" the chief asked, his voice quiet but firm, each word carrying a weight that the officer had yet to fully understand. For a moment, the officer hesitated. There was something about the way the man in front of him spoke that didn't fit the image he had built in his mind. Something about the way he stood, calm and unbothered, that unsettled the officer more than he wanted to admit. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. "You're acting suspicious," the officer shot back, his voice rising. He wasn't asking anymore. He was accusing. He was trying to regain control of the situation, but with every word, it felt like it was slipping further from his grasp. The chief didn't respond immediately. He simply reached into his pocket, pulling out something small and silver. The officer's hand went instinctively to his belt. But then he saw it, the badge. It took a moment for the realization to hit. The officer stared at the badge in silence, the words he had been ready to speak dying on his lips. He blinked, his mind struggling to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. This wasn't just a driver. This wasn't someone who didn't belong. This was the man in charge, the man who ran the department, the man who could end his career with a single phone call. The air between them shifted. The officer, who moments ago had been so sure of himself, now stood frozen, his authority crumbling beneath him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could he say? How could he recover from this? The chief didn't say anything either. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes. The badge in his hand, gleaming in the sunlight, said everything the officer needed to hear. And in that moment, the officer knew. He had made a mistake that would follow him long after this encounter was over. The tension that had been building from the moment the officer stopped the car now hung thick in the air, wrapping around them like a heavy weight. The officer, once so confident, now stood in the shadow of the man he had tried to control. And with every second that passed, the reality of what he had done became more and more undeniable. But the chief, he remained as calm as ever, watching, waiting, as the officer tried to find his footing again. The balance of power had shifted completely, and now the only question left was how far the consequences of this moment would reach. What happens when the man enforcing the law is confronted by the very system he serves? When the authority he wields is stripped away, leaving him exposed for what he truly is? These questions lingered in the air as the officer stood frozen, staring at the badge in the chief's hand, knowing that nothing about this encounter would end the way he had imagined. The officer's eyes were fixed on the badge, the shiny, unmistakable symbol of authority. Yet it was more than just a piece of metal. In that moment, it was the embodiment of everything he had misjudged, everything he had assumed, and everything he was now about to lose. There was no escaping it. The man standing before him wasn't just another driver, another face in the crowd. He was the one person the officer had never expected to encounter in this way. The leader of his own department, the man who held more power than he could ever wield in his uniform. The silence between them stretched on, a heavy, suffocating silence that weighed down the officer's every breath. His mind raced, trying to grasp the enormity of his mistake. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't undo what had already been done. The chief's calm gaze never wavered, his composure unshaken, as if he had expected this moment all along. And maybe he had. The officer's hands trembled slightly, his body betraying the growing fear that now pulsed through him. This was no ordinary traffic stop anymore. This was the end of the road he had thought he controlled. And as the realization hit him, his confidence crumbled, replaced by something much darker: regret. Regret that clung to him like a shadow, whispering in his ear that there was no way out of this. The chief's voice, when it came, was steady, measured, but it carried the weight of authority that needed no explanation. "You know who I am," he said quietly, each word hanging in the air between them. The officer swallowed hard, his throat dry, his pulse quickening. He nodded, his face pale, unable to find the words to respond. For a moment, the two men stood there, locked in a silent exchange. But the balance of power had shifted so completely that there was no question now of who held control. The officer, who minutes before had been so sure of himself, now stood frozen, his career flashing before his eyes. Every decision he had made, every assumption, every misstep, they all led to this. And in that moment, the full weight of his actions pressed down on him. The regret that filled him was overwhelming, a feeling so intense that it seemed to hang in the air like a storm cloud. He knew the consequences of this moment. He knew that nothing he said now could change what had already happened. His authority, once a shield, had become a burden, and now it was slipping through his fingers. The chief took a step closer, his calm demeanor never faltering. "This is how you treat people?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. It wasn't a question that needed an answer. It was a statement, a truth that hung between them like a judgment. The officer shifted uncomfortably, his mind scrambling for something, anything, to say that could make this right. But there was nothing. The silence stretched on, thick with the realization of what had just transpired. The chief's words cut deeper with each moment of quiet. "Do you assume this about everyone you stop?" The officer looked down at the ground, avoiding the chief's gaze. He didn't need to answer. His actions had already done the talking, and there was no taking them back. The regret in his eyes said it all. As the chief continued to speak, there was no raised voice, no anger, only the steady, unwavering authority of a man who had seen this before, who had witnessed this behavior from officers under his command and had worked tirelessly to root it out. But now, standing in front of him, was proof that the problem still lingered within his own department. "I've worked too hard to make this department one that serves with fairness, with integrity," the chief said, his voice firm but calm. "And now, here we are." The officer finally spoke, his voice shaky. I didn't know it was you," he stammered, trying to grasp for an excuse, something to explain away what had just happened. But the chief's gaze didn't soften. He shook his head slowly. "That's the problem," the chief said quietly. "You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with respect." And there it was, the truth laid bare, the reason this encounter was about so much more than a simple traffic stop. The officer's regret deepened, the weight of it pressing down on him with every passing second. His mind raced with the realization that this moment could be the end of everything he had worked for. The chief stepped back, his presence still commanding. "You'll hear about this," he said, his voice still low. But the meaning behind the words was clear. The officer's career now hung in the balance, and it wasn't in his hands anymore. The gravity of the situation was undeniable. There was no walking away from this without consequences. The officer's heart pounded in his chest, his mind filled with regret for what he had done, and fear for what was to come. He knew that his actions would be scrutinized, dissected by those higher up, and judged by the very man he had tried to assert power over. His career, everything he had built, was now on the line, hanging by a thread. As the chief turned to leave, the officer stood there, frozen, watching the man he had tried to control walk away. The flashing lights of the patrol car, once symbols of his authority, now seemed meaningless. In that instant, the officer understood that the tables had turned, and there was no going back. What do you think should happen next? Should the officer face disciplinary action? Should his career come to an end for this mistake? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you're as engrossed in this story as we are, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that challenge everything you thought you knew. The confrontation between the officer and the chief was a single moment, but its significance reached far beyond the roadside. This wasn't just about one traffic stop gone wrong. It was about something much larger, something that had been present in the background for far too long. The issue of racial bias in policing is not new, but every time an incident like this occurs, it forces the question, how many other moments just like this one go unnoticed, unseen by the public eye? This is a reality for many. Routine interactions with law enforcement that take a turn not because of the actions of the person involved, but because of the assumptions and judgments made long before a single word is spoken. Assumptions that are informed not by facts, but by race, by appearance, by preconceived notions of who someone is based solely on the color of their skin. Racial bias in policing has been a subject of heated debate for years. But beyond the discussions, beyond the headlines, there are real lives affected, real consequences that ripple through families and communities. Studies have shown that black drivers are far more likely to be stopped by law enforcement than white drivers. According to a 2019 study by Stanford University, black drivers were 20% more likely to be pulled over than white drivers during the day, a number that only drops at night when it becomes harder to identify a driver's race from a distance. The data is clear, and it tells a story of deep-rooted bias that continues to shape the way people are treated on the road. But the numbers don't stop at traffic stops. Nationwide, black individuals are disproportionately subjected to searches, interrogations, and arrests, even when they are less likely to be found with contraband compared to white individuals. These numbers are not just statistics. They represent lived experiences, moments where someone's race becomes the deciding factor in how they are treated, whether they are presumed guilty or given the benefit of the doubt. Experts in law enforcement reform have long pointed to the need for systemic change. Racial profiling is a symptom of a larger issue, says Professor David Harris, an expert on racial bias in policing. It's not just about individual officers. It's about the systems that allow these biases to go unchecked, the training that fails to address the real-world impacts of these decisions, and the lack of accountability that permits them to continue. The issue, as Harris explains, is not just about intentional acts of racism. It's about implicit bias, the unconscious associations that guide decisions, often without the officer even realizing it. It's in the split-second decisions, the instincts officers rely on, where we see these biases play out, he continues. The problem is that these instincts are shaped by a culture that has historically treated black people with suspicion, and until that changes, the outcomes will continue to reflect those biases. The consequences of this bias ripple outward. For the officer, his career now hangs in the balance, but for the chief, this incident was yet another reminder of the struggles that persist within his department and the community he has fought to protect. He has worked tirelessly to ensure that his officers uphold the values of fairness and equality. But this moment showed that the work is far from over. The chief's authority may have been recognized that day, but his trust in the system was shaken. In the hours and days that followed the incident, word of the encounter spread through the community. Conversations that had once been whispered behind closed doors were now being spoken openly. Local residents, many of whom had their own stories of being unfairly stopped or questioned, began to share their experiences on social media, fueling a growing conversation about bias in the police force. News outlets picked up the story quickly. Headlines reflected the gravity of the situation. Police chief pulled over by his own officer, a lesson in racial bias. The coverage was widespread, but for many in the community, this wasn't news. It was confirmation of what they had known all along. It was proof that even those at the highest levels of authority weren't immune to the biases that shaped their daily lives. Local community leaders were quick to respond. "This isn't just about one officer," said one activist during a town hall meeting held in the aftermath of the incident. "This is about a system that allows these assumptions to dictate how we're treated, day in and day out. It's about the fact that even a police chief, someone who should be above this kind of treatment, isn't safe from the biases that define how black people are seen in this country." As the community wrestled with the reality of what had happened, the department itself was forced to reckon with its own shortcomings. There were internal reviews, discussions about new training protocols, and public statements promising accountability. But for many, those promises rang hollow. They had heard them before, after every high-profile incident that made the news. They had seen promises of reform, only to watch as little changed in their day-to-day interactions with law enforcement. How many other moments like this one have gone unnoticed? How many times have drivers been stopped, questioned, and treated as suspects simply because of the color of their skin? These are the questions that lingered in the minds of those who watched the story unfold. And for the officer, the weight of his actions settled in. What he had seen as a routine stop had become a symbol of something much larger. His regret was no longer just about a mistake. It was about realizing that he had contributed to a system that, whether knowingly or not, treated people differently based on their race. His career, his future, was now in the hands of the very man he had tried to control. As the community watched, as the nation discussed, one truth became clear. This was not an isolated incident. This was a reflection of a broader problem, one that had been ignored for too long, and one that could no longer be swept under the rug. The encounter was over, but the consequences had only just begun. What happened on that roadside could not be erased, and now, in the aftermath, the town and the nation was forced to confront the reality of what had unfolded. The officer, who just hours before had been confident in his authority, now found himself at the center of an investigation, his actions scrutinized by the very institution that had once supported him. He had misjudged a man, and in doing so, he had misjudged the very values he was sworn to uphold. The first wave of fallout came swiftly. An internal review was launched, and the officer was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. It was a standard procedure, but the weight of it was anything but standard. This wasn't just about protocol. This was about accountability. The department had to act, not just because of who had been involved, but because of the broader implications for the entire force. The public was watching, and they were demanding answers. In the days that followed, the police chief himself addressed the community. His words, carefully measured yet firm, carried the authority of someone who had spent years working to create change. What happened during this traffic stop is a reflection of the issues we continue to face in policing, the chief said during a press conference. We have a responsibility to hold ourselves to the highest standards, and when those standards are not met, there must be accountability. The chief's statement was clear. This was not going to be swept under the rug. There would be consequences for the officer's actions, and the department would not shy away from addressing the systemic issues that allowed such incidents to occur in the first place. His tone was serious, but beneath the words lay a deeper frustration. A frustration with the slow pace of change, with the constant battles to shift the culture of a system that had been resistant to reform. As for the officer, his public statement came later, and when it did, it was clear that the gravity of the situation had sunk in. I regret what happened that day, he said, his voice strained. I let my assumptions guide my actions, and for that, I take full responsibility. I understand now that what I did was wrong, and I am committed to learning from this and doing better. The apology, while necessary, was not enough to quell the storm that had erupted. The community was divided. Some believed that the officer's regret was genuine, that his career shouldn't end over one mistake. Others felt that the apology rang hollow, that it was too little, too late. The question now wasn't just about what had happened during the stop. It was about what this moment represented. For many, it was a tipping point, the latest in a long line of incidents that exposed the deep-rooted biases within law enforcement. Social media exploded with reactions. On one side, there were those who defended the officer, pointing to the pressures of the job, the split-second decisions that often had to be made. It was a mistake, sure, one comment read, but should we destroy a man's career over it? He's apologized. Let him make amends. But on the other side, the calls for accountability were louder. This isn't just about one officer, another post declared. This is about a system that allows this kind of behavior to continue unchecked. An apology isn't enough. There needs to be real consequences. News outlets across the country picked up the story, and soon it was being discussed on a national level. Headlines captured the intensity of the public debate. Police chief pulled over by own officer in apparent racial profiling incident. Law enforcement under fire as traffic stop sparks outrage. The media coverage was relentless. Each new detail scrutinized, each new statement dissected for its broader meaning. Pundits debated on television screens, while opinion pieces filled the pages of newspapers and online forums. This was no longer just about one town. This was about the nation's ongoing struggle with race and policing. For the chief, the attention was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, the incident had brought to light the very issues he had been fighting against for years. On the other, it cast a harsh spotlight on his department, raising questions about whether the reforms he had implemented were enough. In interviews, he was asked repeatedly about the culture within his force, about what more could be done to prevent incidents like this from happening again. His answers were honest, but they reflected the reality of a man who knew that change, true change, was still a long way off. "We have to be better," the chief said in one interview. "We have to acknowledge the biases that exist, and we have to work tirelessly to root them out. This is about more than just one officer. This is about creating a system that treats everyone fairly, that doesn't allow for these kinds of assumptions to dictate how we interact with the public." The incident became a rallying cry for those calling for police reform. Protests erupted in the town, peaceful but passionate, with signs that read, "Justice for all," and "End racial profiling." The conversations weren't just about punishment for the officer. They were about the need for systemic change. Activists called for better training, for accountability at every level of law enforcement, for the dismantling of the biases that had been allowed to fester for too long. The officer's future remained uncertain. The investigation would determine whether he would be allowed to return to duty, whether he would face disciplinary action, or whether his career in law enforcement would come to an end. But for the community, the question wasn't just about one man's future. It was about the future of policing as a whole. "How do we move forward from this?" one community leader asked during a town hall meeting. "How do we ensure that this doesn't happen again? How many other officers are out there, making the same assumptions, treating people differently because of the color of their skin? This isn't just about one encounter. This is about changing the entire system." The aftermath of the encounter left a mark on the town, but it also left a mark on the country. It forced a conversation that had been building for years, one that could no longer be ignored. And as the weeks turned into months, the story remained a symbol of both the progress that had been made and the long road that still lay ahead. The road to accountability is never easy. But in the wake of this incident, it became clear that accountability is not just about punishment, it's about change. Real, lasting change that starts with acknowledging the problem and ends with a system that truly serves all of its people. The story we've covered today isn't unique, and as much as we wish it were, encounters like these are happening every day. But this isn't the end of the conversation. It's only the beginning. Injustice, bias, and the fight for accountability remain at the forefront of our society, and these stories need to be told. Next video, we'll be diving into another shocking case where the tables turn in ways you won't believe. We'll explore how a routine situation turned into a moment of reckoning, challenging everything we thought we knew about power and fairness. It's a story that raises even more questions about justice and who really holds it in their hands. You won't want to miss it. So if you're passionate about uncovering the truth, If these stories of real-life encounters and their far-reaching consequences matter to you, make sure you hit that subscribe button and hang on your notifications. Together, we'll continue to explore these powerful stories and dig into the issues that shape our world. See you next time. Same place, same drive for truth. If this story hit you as hard as it hit me, don't forget to smash that like button. It really helps us get these important conversations out to more people. And we want to hear from you. What would you have done if you were in the police chief's shoes? What do you think should happen to the officer? Drop your thoughts down in the comments. We're reading everything, and your voice matters in these discussions. And if you believe stories like this need to be told, make sure to subscribe and share this video with your friends. These real-life events impact all of us, and the more we talk about them, the more we can push for the accountability and justice we all deserve. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.